this video is a preview of the next episode of All for All, which is titled Please Don't Kick the Robo-Dog on Fascism, Futurism, and Feelings. You can anticipate what it's about. It's about all the new billionaire philosophies and schools of thought that are being used to justify their predation and their invasions of privacy and time and everything else, and the utterly dystopian and horrifying futures they're building for us. How much of that comes from the philosophies themselves? How much comes from the fact that they're drawn to obscure philosophies that serve their ego needs? How much of it is just embedded in human culture? Well, that's a lot to take on. We're not going to do this here. Since this is just a preview, I thought I would just talk about one section of the talk, which is about transhumanism. Transhumanism is an idea that's been around, I think, since about the 80s. With that name. And yes, it's become something horrible in the hands of billionaires. But what is it exactly? If you ask different people, including within the transhumanist movement, you'll get different answers, and that's part of the problem. What I call transhumanism, the desire to transcend through artificial means the currently accepted human limits of physical and mental possibility. I think it's an assertion of the right to radically remake yourself, what one transhumanist calls morphological freedom, and it's an embrace of technology as an instrument of self-expression and self-transformation. Now, that may seem brilliant to you, it may seem insane to you. I have my own thoughts about it, but nothing in there intrinsically says billionaires ought to control our lives. That happens when it combines with some other toxic elements. And that's why I wanted to talk a little about Elvis as an example, because in the full video, I'll be making the point that the impulse to transform and transcend our limited humanity has been with us since the first tools were used, since the first weapons were used, since the first prayer was said, since humans made the first works of art. In fact, you can find transhumanist ideas throughout human art and literature throughout history. In the last century, there have been all sorts of plays, movies, novels, everything else about robots, for example, which are a kind of transhuman. It goes all the way. A lot of people put the start of that at a 1920 Czech play called RUR, or Rossum's Universal Robots, bearing in mind that robot is in Russian and Czech, a robotnik is a worker. And so in the play, the robots develop intelligence, which is something we'll talk a lot about in the full episode, and they rise up against their so-called masters. But that wasn't the first transhumanist narrative in literature. You can go back to Frankenstein. A few decades before, Frankenstein was an attempt to conquer death, which is a huge part of the transhumanist and related movements. And there have been legends you could call transhumanists going all the way back to ancient times, golems and all sorts of artificial servants, but also the search for immortality in our literature is as old perhaps as literature itself. But if we say that transhumanism is an embrace of artificially altering yourself to meet some kind of norm, well, first of all, I guess many of us are that in one way or another. The cyborg is the idea of an organism that is part machine and part human. Well, I have something implanted in my ear right now, as well. I wasn't able to record this series last week. I guess in a very tiny way. I'm a cyborg, I'm transhuman. I have a cup of coffee with me, which alters my my brain cells, my bloodstream, my physiology, so that I believe I can be more alert, sharper temporarily, and so on. That's a form of transhumanism. And in the arts, it's has sometimes reached an extreme state. For example, a lot of people pointed out, especially at the time of his death, that Michael Jackson, I'll quote a transhumanist named Are You Serious? Sirius. I don't think that's his birth name, but Are You Serious wrote, quote, Michael Jackson is obviously not an example of transhumanism to be followed, but he is a signpost on the road to post-humanity. I believe the future will study him from that perspective and in some odd way will learn from his mistakes, end quote. Well, again, I don't know, but Michael Jackson certainly altered his facial features, his race. If you define race by skin color, he had vitiligo, but then he whited his entire skin. There are many ways in which we can point to Michael as a transhumanist, but he wasn't the first, even in living memory. This is where Elvis Presley comes in. I always, when I think of, I guess I had the idea for Elvis the Transhumanist from something I read about his very early days, because from the very beginning of his performing life, at age 19, he was an agent of radical transformation in sexual identity and sexuality, in music, of course, in culture, and in appearance. He wore a lot of pink jackets, pink pants, drove a pink car, which was gender bending in the mid 1950s. He changed his hair color and slicked it. He moved in ways that were unusual, often in a kind of sensual embrace with a microphone, which was, of course, a form of technology. And he certainly didn't look like most country western, or as they were sometimes called, hillbilly performers. The 19-year-old singer had to have been an unearthly sight to the announcer at the Louisiana Hayride, that Shreveport country music venue that banned drums until the late 1950s as not being country enough. The Grand Ole Opry did the same thing. There's a recording where the announcer asks, and he sounds nervous, by the way, he says, "You all geared up with your band there?" And this is during a live radio broadcast. Elvis says, "I'm all geared up." Well, all geared up is as good a title of a book on transhumanism as any other. In fact, I've thought of using it. But how geared up was Elvis? Well, he didn't accept traditional gender boundaries. Even as a teenager, he dyed his hair blonde as well as black. He enhanced his beautiful eyes. He really had beautiful eyes with an eyeliner. He wore a pink sport coat, as I said, and that was a huge violation of gender norms. And then he would wear these black, almost cubist peg leg slacks. He would use that to contrast these visual cues of femininity with hyper masculine body movements, pelvic thrusts, and so on, and abnormally large sideburns, with facial hair being an evolutionary cue for male dominance. And in doing all this, he really placed him outside what people today would now call the quote unquote gender binary. His voice, which was really clear and expressive in those early days, was electronically enhanced too. It was trans voiced, even in his earliest recordings, where producer Sam Phillips used a lot of slapback echo on him and to exaggerating the effect, really to a degree that I don't think many records had done before. Slapback was a form of human extension in which a singer's voice was recorded on tiny tape loops and replayed while the vocalist kept on singing. So it made people ethereal, unearthly. I remember I was 5 years old when I first heard Heartbreak Hotel, and that echoey voice sounded like the voice of a ghost to me, but it was really the siren song of self-manipulation. He became his own chorus of doppelgangers or clones. He took a country, an agrarian heartbroken lament built around nature imagery, Blue Moon of Kentucky by Bill Monroe, added electric guitars, switched the beat from a waltz to a 4/4, and created a musical cyborg, half electronic and half rural. They came to name that cyborg rockabilly. He also transcended racial boundaries by adopting a singing style so black that characteristically that when he was interviewed on radio, sometimes he was asked where he went to high school so that that would tip off listeners what race he really was. And as I mentioned earlier, his physical equipment to the his physical relationship to the equipment he used, guitars, mic stands, and all that, very sexual and intimate. He would caress them, hold them, gyrate with them, and thrust toward them like he was trying to fuse with them. He used to bang the hell out of his old acoustic. And as a guitar player myself, I will tell you that when a guitar player is played with full commitment and passion, the player and the musician become a kind of, or rather the player and the instrument become a kind of human machine hybrid, especially if it's an electric guitar. Watch some Hendrix footage and see for yourself. Elvis wasn't a great guitar player, but nobody could doubt his commitment to the instrument. He also bought all sorts of fancy cars, which was the 20th century male's ultimate extender, shall we say, for himself, for friends, for strangers, sending them out in the world in a fleet like drone shadows of his unbounded ego. Later in life, he shot televisions with a gun, too, when he didn't like what he saw. Made him kind of a pioneer in the world of media interactivity. And here's a trivia question. What career was Elvis planning to follow before he made it big? Electrician. And of course, late period Elvis, rockabilly purists dismiss the guy in the sequin suit, the fat guy in the sequin suit, but there were still flashes of Elvis's brilliance. And like many transhumanists, he used performance enhancing drugs to amplify his abilities. They apparently contributed to his death. His outfits were kind of transhumanist too. This is the one they call wings. And he really does seem to be trying to transcend the limits of a human movement there. And then there were his late period performances where he didn't sleep. There was kind of a Leni Riefenstahl type of architecture, proclaiming that desire to dominate nature. Onstage karate moves, projections of individual power. The cape, a superhero trope. The rhinestones, thin synthetic stars for the man who would have been a galaxy. And the song that by then had become his theme, If I Can Dream, could have been a transhumanist anthem. There he was, crooning to his all his followers, a fallen angel, a cyborg in waiting, singing, as long as a man has the strength to dream, he can redeem his soul and fly. The song that used to play over the loudspeakers as late period Elvis took the stage, also sprach Zarathustra, that hymn to the Nietzschean Übermensch. He was so convinced of his powers that when he started to lose it late in life, he used to think he could move clouds with his mind. No wonder the rumors persisted that he was still alive so many years after his death. He seemed immortal. Even his first name sends a subliminal message because it's an anagram. Lives, lives. Now, Elvis might have used up his last life in the sci-fi landscape of Las Vegas. That's as off-world an experience as any earthbound human is ever likely to see. But he didn't die there. He died at home in Memphis, a city named for the ancient capital of Inebu Hedge in ancient Egypt, to which we say, sic transit gloria. Elvis Presley died as he lived, transfixed and addicted to limitless possibility, in love with the infinite I, in love and all geared up. Thanks for listening, and as always, I welcome your thoughts.